Alright, so why don't we make our own max function. There's already a max built into Python, so this is completely useless and a waste of time. However, it is just a practice. So if you're looping through a list trying to find the max, you don't know where exactly the max is in the list. So you have to loop through every single element basically. There's not really, yeah, that's basically the easiest way. Also, like a pretty generic example of a function is like a sorting function, and that's like one of the first things that people do. They just make a sorting function. We could do that too if you guys are interested, but not that interesting. It just sorts a list and by like list by from least to greatest. Doesn't really matter. You can look that up online if you guys are curious. But anyways, so we have a parameter now, which is slightly different, and you guys can actually set the parameter to a default value if you're like so inclined, but we don't need to do that for now. In the future you can do that. So you have a parameter list, and you don't have to set the parameter to any like type like you would have to do in Java, because it's Python, super flexible. And now you can just loop through the list. Oh, you need a variable, by the way. So we can set this variable to, let's see, what would we want to set this variable to? Okay, you can set the variable to the first element in the list, which, if you remember, is indicated by 0 because it's 0 indexed. So now you have an element x, which is set to the first variable, or first element in the list. You have a variable x set to the first element in the list, and that's going to be a number. And now you want to loop through the rest of the list and compare the initial variable x to the other values. And if you find a value that is greater than x, you assign it to x, right? So now we have a greater max. So we can create a variable for that too. So we can call it just temp max, right? So it's temporary max. You don't no, wait, my bad. Sorry, x is the temporary max. Yeah, confusing myself. Okay, yes. So you have to have good variable names. Okay, so x is the temporary max. When you're listening through a list, you're gonna go to your first element, and you're gonna be like, wow, it's a 1, it's a -1, it's a -100. That's my temporary max, because I have no idea what's the rest in the list. So we'll set that to the temporary max just for now. And then as you loop through, so you can do for num in list, and then now you can compare each element num in the list to temporary max. So you would need an if statement for this, right? So if temp max is less than num, or actually it makes more sense if we go the other way around. If num is greater than temp max, go inside there, you set temp max equal to num. Does that make sense for everyone? Just the kind of logic there. So you're looping through each element in this list. Why don't we move this list down here? So initially you set temp max to list at 0, which is 3. And now you're gonna loop through each element in this list. It's gonna go for num in list, so it's gonna look at 3 first. We don't need to do that, just a loss of efficiency, because obviously it's gonna be equal. So it's gonna first compare 3 to 3. If num 3 is greater than temp max, if 3 is greater than 3, which is not, so it doesn't enter the if statement, nothing happens. And then it will continue going on into the list. It'll compare 6 and then 7. 6 is greater, so temp max is going to be set to 6. Then 7 is greater, so it's going to be set to 7. 6 is not greater than 7, not going to be set to 7. 7 is not greater, so etc. Right? It goes to 10. It finds temp. 10 is the temp max. And now you have this variable. You have 10 sent to temp max, and you need to get 10 out somehow. You need to get 10 out of the function. And how you would do that in a function is a return. You just return, and then you do temp max. And what a return does is it like poops out the whatever you want to return. and once you hit the return, even if I had code down here that said like print something, print hello, it's never gonna enter this, even if it's inside the body of the if statement or the body of the what you call it, function. Once you hit return, it's just it exits out of the function. The function stops executing. So even if I had a bunch of code afterwards, blah 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 blah, right? It's just never gonna get down there. And even if you put this inside the for loop, and it might not necessarily execute, if it does execute, it's just gonna stop. So that's pretty self-explanatory. It's kind of like it just kind of quits it out, right? There's even a function called quit, but we don't have to go over that right now. So this just completely quits it out, and let's see if this works. So we could either call myMax and then assign to list. These two are the same. They don't have to be the same. It just so happens that this is a list and my parameter name's a list, but no problem there. So if we run this, we get 10. So what's happening is it goes through all this logic and it returns the temporary max, which in this case is 10. It doesn't have to be. If I added other numbers to this, say 12, right, it's going to return 12. And then it gets to the if statement, and it gets to the return and returns whatever 10 max is assigned to. Does that make sense for everyone? Like, you have this little packet of code now that you can use over and over again as many times as you want with myMax. Does that make sense? We went over parameters. Any questions? If you guys have used other programming languages, it should be pretty self-explanatory. But Python is just simpler. You don't have to define what kind of variable this is. You don't have to define if it's like what kind of scope the method is, for example, in Java.
Let's talk about local versus overhead. You want to talk about
Oh yeah, local scope and global scope. Yeah, sure. So when we're looking at functions and when we're looking at the entire program, you have a global scope, which is just like if you look at the whole wider program, you have, if these were uncommented out, you would have an X variable, you would have an str variable, string variable, you would have a list variable. These are all global variables. They're global and they're in the whole entire scope. And this is a global function, right? It's like inside the main thing. It's inside the main programming body of the program. When you go inside of the function, you're in a local scope now because it's limited to what you have in here. This is just going to look for what's in here, and then it's going to look for what's outside the global. But you can have local functions too. You can define a function inside of a function, and then you can define other functions inside of that too. It gets kind of confusing, but for example, temp max is a local variable inside of here, inside of the function myMax. If you were to look for temp, if you want to print temp max outside of myMax, it's not going to be able to find it because it's in the local and it's not in the global scope. So if you were to print like temp max, it's going to throw you an error because it has no idea where it is. You never defined it in the global scope. So what you normally do is you return something, and that will allow you to print it out. And also, it's generally not good programming practice to change variables from inside of a function. You would generally want to return it. So it's doable, but some cases it does not work. So it's generally good programming practice to return whatever you want to return. I actually think I might have done that in here. Yeah, maybe I think so, maybe. So it's okay, it works, but you should return it. So do as I say, not as I do. But if you, for an example, like this is not gonna work. If you like, for example, num is in the local scope of the for loop. You wouldn't be able to print num even inside of the function itself. So if I want to like print num outside of the for loop, does it work? No, it shouldn't work. I don't think. Let me try. Yeah. So it's not going to print anything because, oh, I didn't call a function, my bad. Yeah, let's see if this works. Yeah. So, it's not printing anything, right?
That means you can use like the same variable names. Like
Yeah. Good point. Yeah. So if I had a temp max out here, well, yeah, it gets confusing at that point. So try to like keep your variable names different. But if I say had another for loop or another def max function, and instead it was like my min, just the opposite, we can keep these the same. You can have another num, and you can have another temp max in here, and it's not gonna interfere with here, because these are local. Temp max and num, they're all local to their local scope, so it's not really a problem. Even though these two functions are gonna do the same, but if you were to like swap this, now you have a print num function. So we can even try it out. Hopefully it works. It should work, right? Alright, so what was the min? Yeah, so there you go. This one does the max, and this one does the min.